Hello, everyone. This is Beatles Examiner Steve Marinucci welcoming you to another edition of Things We Said Today, our weekly discussion of all things Beatle that'll takes us anywhere and everywhere. Let me, before we talk about what we're going to be talking about, let me introduce my co-host first, or the host of the radio show Every Little Thing, Ken Michaels. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Steve. Hi, everybody.
And I should say to my virtual right, because they're all on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, or I guess depending on which way I'm looking. But to the other side of the country, also writing for Beatle Fan magazine and an author in his own right. And I'm not talking about John Lennon. First, we have Mr. Al Sussman.
Hey, Steve. Hello there, everybody.
And also out on the East Coast, another author in his own right, also writing for Beatle Fan and many other publications, Mr. Allan Kozinn. Hello, Allan.
Hey, Steve. Hello, everyone.
And we're going to talk today. There was a lot of discussion on the internet this week about Keith Richards' comments about Sgt. Pepper being rubbish. That got a lot of blowback from people, a lot of comments of people complaining about Keith and about the Stones and about talking about the Beatles, and we thought we would go through that today. And we have a special guest, and you know the special guest if you've been hanging around the show for a while, because he is the gentleman who wrote our theme music, our great theme music, but he also is a Stones fan, and he's going to try and defend the Rolling Stones on a Beatles show. And that would be Mr. Michael Lynch. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody. And
go ahead. I was just going to say we're ganging up on you 4-1.
Well, well, let me just make this clear. I mean, I know a lot of you guys know me as the Stones fan, but the truth is I am a huge fan of both groups. And whereas some of you have seen me on the Beatle boards defending the Stones, if you had been on the Stones boards, there have been plenty of times where the tables have been turned and I'm defending the Beatles. So I have been on both sides of the fence, and it is an interesting place.
It definitely is. It definitely is. Let's start about the whole thing anyway. I mean, I really found, and anybody that wants to come in on this, say so. In reading his comments in context, I didn't think he was really complaining that much about Sgt. Pepper, because he was talking about both Pepper and their Satanic Majesty's Request, and he basically said that both he didn't like either one. Did anybody want to talk on that and and tell me what you think?
Well, I think Keith, much like John Lennon, Keith tends to say things just almost for the shock value of what they're going to look like in print. Mm-hmm. And he may not completely believe what he's actually saying, but just to throw a zinger out there. I mean, after all, Keith is a huge Beatles fan. I mean, it was Keith who, in 2005, suggested that Paul begin performing "Please Please Me."
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And there's an outtake out there of him doing "Please Please Me," as I recall, that is actually really, really good. I mean, it's just him in the studio alone, but it's a lot of fun to listen to. He did a great little ad-lib version of it,
Yeah.
So I agree that he does tend to open his mouth and and say things. I mean, that's the way he is with everything. I mean, that's his personality. But the whole thing. Go ahead.
I think he meant it at face value. I don't see why not. I mean, I'm sure Keith hated Satanic Majesty's Request just as much as he hated Sgt. Pepper, and I think he basically was blaming Sgt. Pepper for them doing Satanic Majesty's Request, because as John Lennon used to point out, just look at what we did and see what the Stones do 2 months later, I think that they, I think in both cases, I think I think it's probably a little unfair to look back at it that way, because it was heading into that psychedelic era where everybody was doing stuff, not just the Beatles, and that was just the sound of the times. And I really like Satanic Majesty's Request of it. Apparently, I'm in the minority among Stones fans, even. But
Right.
I've always liked that album, and so I think that Keith is more of a hardcore blues guy, and he doesn't. I don't think he really wants to be involved with singing, 2,000 light years from home and that kind of stuff. And I can see why he would have thought the whole thing was just not his cup of tea, and Pepper in the same way. And so, yeah, I took it pretty much at face value. I think he meant it. And I think that because so many Stones fans seem to feel that Satanic Majesties is some sort of embarrassment in their catalog, I think that he wouldn't have thought of it as being shock value for those people, that he would expect them to agree. So that's just my take on it.
I kind of agree with exactly what Allan said. I think this quote from Keith is more a reflection of the direction that the Stones were going into, and the Beatles, because I think at heart he is an R&B guy, a blues guy, and he liked the more pure rock and roll, simple guitars and drums, a little bit of piano. And probably didn't like the fact the Beatles were getting into psychedelic. And like Allan was saying, so many bands were doing that too. He didn't want the Stones to go in that direction. So, yeah, I'm sure that he also didn't like both those albums. So I think it's more a reflection of the direction that both bands were going into.
And that's kind of proven out by the fact that the next two Stones albums after Satanic Majesties were very much back to the roots. And, Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, were very, very much of a return to the Stones, their best musical instincts.
Mm-hmm. And there's a quote in the Esquire interview that really kind of says it. It says what he really feels about both albums. He says, after he said it was a mishmash of rubbish, kind of like Satanic Majesties, he said, "Oh, if you can make a load of shit, so can we." So that basically says how seriously they took it. Michael, what do you have to say?
I'm pretty much agreeing with most of what you guys have said so far. I'll say that when I first saw the quote and I heard it, I thought it was a pretty funny quote, actually, because when Keith talks in an interview, he always seems very casual and, he laughs. He seems like a friendly guy in a good mood. So, when I read those comments from Keith, I pictured him like that, and it was easy to just think of him just saying that with a smile on his face, and I could find it funny. Whereas if Pete Townsend, who I love, a great guy, I love Pete, but, he often comes across as very sullen and bitter in his interviews, or, like a guy with a chip on his shoulder. I think it would take on a different context, and I don't know. So, I just kind of laughed at the comments when I read it, and I knew it would be upsetting to a lot of fans, but I figured, what the heck. It's Keith. I love the guy.
Even if Mick had said it, I think it would have taken on a whole different tone. I think
agree.
You're absolutely right, and it would have been. Every time when Mick says something, people get real serious about what he says. I think you're right, though. I think people tend to take Keith a lot less seriously. Allan, you mentioned something. I think it was on Facebook yesterday, or in the emails when we were talking about this. You mentioned about Keith's autobiography, and I looked it up, and he actually called Satanic Majesties a put-on.
Yeah,
which is another way of looking at it, because I never really thought of it as more. I thought they were fairly serious, but I guess to think of it as a put-on would have been, puts a whole new light on the whole thing too.
I never believed that. So, that I thought was Keith saying something for shock value.
Yeah.
Listen to that album. If something is a put-on, it's a little clearer, and not to mention that there were lots of bootlegs of outtakes from the sessions. I think that, and they're working pretty seriously on these things, and I don't know. I don't buy it.
Okay.
What about you, Michael?
Well, Let me just tell you where I stand on Satanic. I mean, I do prefer, even though I'm supposed to be the Stones defender here, I do prefer Pepper to Satanic, but that's only really because there's one or two cuts. I don't think there are any bad cuts on Sgt. Pepper, whereas there's one or two cuts on Satanic that I just a Gomper. I'm thinking I don't really care for that one too much. So I mean, just for point value, that's why I prefer Pepper. Although I don't believe either album is either band's best album of 1967. So there's a thought for you.
Huh.
I actually,
Really?
I actually prefer Magical Mystery Tour to Sgt. Pepper. I don't know why. I think I just like the songs better. But I prefer Between the Buttons to Satanic.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
I can go with that.
That's an interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can go with the latter. I'm not sure if I can go with about the Magical Mystery Tour, but I
think that's largely because it's got I Am the Walrus, which is one of my all-time favorite songs. So that takes extra point value. I don't know.
Yeah, we may be demurring about that because it wasn't really an album, but but it kind of was here. So this is before you were born, apparently.
Yeah.
For
stick it to
You know what I mean?
Sticked.
When it's funny when Satanic Majesties came out, I think the track I liked best, and for a weird stereo wiring reason, was Citadel, because
Great track.
I really like that track, and the way my house was wired, we had the stereo speakers in the living room, but for some reason my father had wired like the left channel only speaker into this other room, sort of where the washer and dryer was, and so if I was folding up clothes or something, I'd listen to Citadel and just hear the instrumental track, and I really liked that better than the whole track.
Wow.
But I think also in both cases, I'm not sure I want to admit this thing, seeing as I'm supposed to be essentially a musical guy. I think in both cases the packaging comes into it too. I think of both Pepper and Satanic Majesties as the full package with the cover, and Satanic Majesties, you have to admit, had a pretty special cover with the four Beatles in the picture. So there was just something about both of them that I really liked, and I don't skip any cuts when I play Satanic Majesties either, not even Sing This All Together and See What Happens or Gomper. Also, you get to hear something from Bill Wyman, in another land. I really like that too. I like that harpsichord, and it just was a bit different for them. And I liked what they had been doing before. Really liked what they did after, but I still have a soft spot for that album.
One problem I do have with that album, I mean, all in all, I think it's a very good album. I enjoy it a lot. One problem I have is the sequencing, because my three favorite songs on the album are not necessarily in this order, but they are Sing This All Together, Citadel, and In Another Land. Those are the first three songs on the album. So in other words, the album peaks early for me.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't like She's a Rainbow, Michael?
I've gone back and forth on that one. I like it. I never really liked the Ooh La Las, I got to be honest. But I think it's a good song. I think one thing I never was too crazy about that song, the way it kind of stops and starts, which I guess is part of the effect, but I don't know, it's almost like it's almost like it's slowing down, like there's a problem or something like that. I don't know.
Actually, to give Satanic Majesties kind of its due, there were a whole bunch of albums that came out in the second half of 67 and the beginning of the first 3 or 4 months of 68, which were very much, kind of based on the whole Sgt. Pepper idea, or at least influenced by it. And most of them, after bathing at Baxter's by Jefferson Airplane, the Rascals' Once Upon a Dream, Vanilla Fudge's The Beat Goes On, which might be one of the worst albums ever made. Most of those albums were really bad and were definitely not good fits for those particular bands. But Satanic Majesties, even with a little, with some excess that, was probably not necessary, it certainly was a hell of a lot better than The Beat Goes On.
I'll laugh at that, even though I'm a Long Islander. You're insulting my local boys.
Oh, that's right. Because the Fudge were from Long Island, which is your neck of the woods.
I am literally about 10 minutes away from where those albums were recorded, actually.
Wow, really?
Wow, really?
It's now a laundromat. I kid you not. Ultrasonic Studios is now like a laundromat and a pet store, I think.
Wow.
The beat does not go on.
Rock history lives. Oh my God. What a shame. But I mean, this whole thing, I mean, let's open it up a little further to the whole idea of the Beatles versus the Stones. And I know, 2 books have been done on this, and I'm not trying, and outside of what those books say, because I mean, those are not what we're talking about. I mean, among us, what do we think about the Beatles versus the Stones? Ken, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind, because you've been quiet. You've been too quiet.
I thought I'd never hear you say that. No, I love both bands. I don't really. The Beatles will always be the greatest band of all time for me, but with all the great bands, they all have their own identity, and the Stones have put out some of the greatest rock and roll of all time. I've never, said anything negative about the Stones through the years, because when it comes to putting out not only the original songs that they've done, which is amongst some of the greatest rock songs ever, but I like the songs that they've covered too. They are great at what they do. They're just not as musically eclectic as the Beatles have been, and I'm very much into eclecticism, but that doesn't make them worse or less of a band for me, because what they do so well. You don't think the Stones disco period made them eclectic? Oh, no. There are different styles that the Stones have done, but nowhere near to the degree that the Beatles have done, and that's also including all their solo music. Okay. I love the country stuff that the Stones have done, like Faraway Eyes, and I love the disco period too, as well. But by and large, I love, the rock and roll and the R&B based stuff. A song like Mixed Emotions, it's one of my favorite of their more recent, it's going back now, but they're still great at putting out great songs with amazing hooks. And I admire artists that really expand themselves musically and go in a lot of different directions, which is why I love the Beatles so much. It's one of the many reasons, but the Beatles went in so many different directions, from not just the rock and the pop, but also country music, some blues, the Indian music, the classical music, the psychedelic stuff. And then in the solo, music they put out, they went even further. Mm-hmm. Paul McCartney has gone through, he's just recorded so many different styles now. George Harrison got into Oriental type music, There's so many different styles that the Beatles have done that makes me admire them even more. But, when it comes to putting out some great rock and roll, kick-ass rock and roll that still sounds so fresh, the Stones are amongst the best that there is. But, I love the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, all the great British bands, because, they have their own identity and they're all great at what they do. I don't necessarily like to say that one is the best, although the Beatles will always be the best for me. Mm-hmm. That's just how I feel.
Okay. No, okay. I know I wasn't trying to interrupt you. I thought you were finished. Did you want to say a little more? Or...
No. I just wanted to add one thing about Keith's comment, which is one of the developments that I like to bring up every now and then about the Beatles is that I've noticed how through the years an album like Revolver has just, people admire it so much more now than they ever have, to the degree where they rank it higher than Sgt. Pepper, which Sgt. Pepper was always looked at as being the greatest rock album of all time on almost every single music poll. And I think there has been a wave over the years, maybe the last couple of decades, in fact, where rock fans tend to prefer music that's produced that's simpler in terms of production, where it's not so layered and so complicated and artsy, like Sgt. Pepper became, and Sgt. Pepper is. So Keith's comments fall in line with what a lot of rock fans and Beatle fans feel. I'm not saying everybody rates Revolver higher than Sgt. Pepper, although I think amongst this group there may be a few that do. But I'm just saying, when I hear comments like that, there are a lot of fans who point to the music of the Beatles that in terms of production was much simpler, and in terms of songwriting was simpler, although they were always progressing. So it just falls in line with a lot of what I've heard in recent years when I think about that. Because I always think about this thing about Revolver, and I'm amazed, and I'm fascinated by it all, how Revolver has risen so highly in so many music polls as being not only the greatest Beatles album, but for some people, the greatest album of all time. So there are a lot of people who like the music that's pre-1967. And I even remember recently somebody wrote into Facebook, just bouncing off something that was said about the Beatles and looking at 1967 as their year of overindulgence. And there may be a lot of people who feel that way now. And then they went back to being a band again with the White Album, even though a lot of the White Album had the Beatles working in different studios at the same time. But, you know what I'm saying, in terms of production, in terms of getting down to just being a rock and roll band, just guitars and drums and a little bit of piano and not much else, and not so much studio musicians, there are people who prefer that. So I think what Keith is saying is similar to the way a lot of rock fans and Beatle fans feel.
Allan?
Yeah, I remember that whole Beatles Stones thing, and I never thought it was all that real, and it kind of wasn't. It was kind of, I think, produced by the Stones' early publicist who had worked for Brian for a while and sort of manufactured this business of, the Beatles are all clean cut and the Stones are really rough and out there. And I think, and I think a lot of people bought into that. I mean, it's funny because in this interview we're talking about with Keith also says the same thing, right? I think he says, everyone said the Beatles were so clean cut and we weren't, but they were just as bad as us, and they were, but there were these sort of two myths created, and I think that a lot of that, I guess it depended, even besides the music, what kind of image appealed to certain people, but I don't know. Among all of my friends, we were all fans of both groups, and as you said, the Kinks and the Who and all that stuff. I mean, we waited for every new release from any of them. I mean, maybe more for the Beatles ones because hey, they're the Beatles. I mean, by definition, what can you say? But I remember when Beggar's Banquet came out, and I think NEW had probably an early acetate of it and was playing it on the air, and there was a lot of excitement, When Jumpin' Jack Flash came out, everyone went crazy, It was I think it was really nice having these two groups that had some supposed theoretical tension, although if you've been reading up on them closely, you knew that they were actually pals as well. And I think also in a sense, maybe John's comments about the Stones repeating what they were doing 2 months later is kind of unfair because they were hanging out and playing each other unfinished things, and and they were probably both getting ideas from each other. I think this was really an incredibly fertile time in rock and roll. Everybody was getting ideas from everybody. I mean, look at the Byrds sort of liked hearing some 12-string stuff on Hard Day's Night, so they started doing their Dylan covers with 12-string. George Harrison hears that and does, If I Needed Someone. And, these things are all sort of same thing with the Beatles and the Beach Boys, that whole rivalry where, Brian heard Rubber Soul and came up with Pet Sounds sort of as a challenge, and then he heard Sgt. Pepper and went crazy because come on, who can equal that? Apologies to Robert Rodriguez and the Revolver contingent. But I mean, I look at that and it's gotten away a little. I've gone off topic a little, but with the Stones and Beatles relationship too, I think that was a really healthy interplay that everybody had in those days, and I don't see it a lot now, But what can you do?
Well, you don't see it as a rivalry?
I don't think it was a real rivalry. It might have been a real rivalry in the sense that, everybody wants to have the number one record, and if they're both out at the same time. But I seem to remember John talking about how there was even sort of collusion so that the Stones and Beatles wouldn't have new singles out at the same time so that they wouldn't displace each other from being number one. Mm-hmm. So, right. I wonder if we should get the,
Wasn't that said also about, other records then, like the Motown records? The Supremes wouldn't put out a single at the same time the Beatles would. They'd wait a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, possibly.
Isn't that true?
I don't really know, but of course it would make sense if you're a record company and you know a new Beatle record's coming out, you probably would clear the decks. But but on the other hand, who knows? I mean, look, it's drowning.
That's
Al, can you hear us, Al, amid all that?
Beneath the fumes from the bus, yes.
You got a comment?
Yeah. Actually, Allan makes an excellent point. But what has always stuck in my craw about the Stones over the years is this whole, and Michael has heard or seen this rant before, so indulge me. But
bring it on.
But I've always had a major problem with this whole thing of the Stones being labeled the world's greatest rock and roll band. They weren't the world's greatest rock and roll band in the 60s. We know who that was. They weren't the world's greatest rock and roll band in the 70s. That was Led Zeppelin, unless you're a particular fan of the Eagles. They weren't the world's greatest rock and roll band in the 80s. That was U2. And after that, it hardly mattered because by the 90s, it had just gotten to the point where the Stones every few years, would, reunite to, make some bucks and charge $500 for a ticket to, an overblown concert. So I just have never subscribed to the whole Stones being the world's greatest rock and roll band. But and also, frankly, I would say, looking at it generously, I would say that after Tattoo You, which is 1981, after that, there's not a whole lot in the Stones catalog that's really worth the attention of most people. And there are a lot of people, in fact, who will say that actually, after Exile on Main Street, that was really the end of the Stones' prime period. And that's a long time ago. So they certainly did. They did great work in the 60s. And yeah, as Allan points out, I think there was a lot of cross-pollination, if you will. There's even a shot of from the Revolver sessions of John holding up a copy of the English version of Aftermath, which I believe had just come out. And so there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two bands. But after the Beatles broke up, the Stones kind of, even though a lot of people will say, well, that the 70s was their greatest period, I would say that's up for argument. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think a lot of that was record company hype. I mean, that greatest rock and roll band was Sam Cutler's introduction to their stage shows, and I mean, you had Little Richard introduced as the king of rock and roll. You had, that kind of thing goes on. I mean, I think even Bo Diddley was introduced as the king of rock and roll. I mean, that kind of thing goes on with whoever's playing on stage. And I don't know if you can take that seriously. I think it's the music that really counts. And while I will say that, the Stones put out some fantastic albums. I mean, that period through Exile on Main Street is absolutely mind-blowing. I agree, there was some drop-off. One of the Stones albums I really have had trouble listening to is Black and Blue. I do not like Black and Blue.
Not at all.
Now, some girls I like. I think I liked Emotional Rescue and Tattoo You. I think it was after Tattoo You where it started to drop off a little bit, and then it really started to drop off.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't run out to buy a Stones album in quite a while. I think I picked up Bigger Bang on a used as a used CD because I didn't run out and buy it when it first came out. So I mean, I'm not, the fact that they're still playing live is great. I'm not sure I'd really want to go see them now. I'm sorry I didn't go see them in the 70s with Mick Taylor. I really regret that. I really regret I didn't see them.
Steve, I saw them at Madison Square Garden in in the summer of '72 during the what I guess people have called the Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones tour.
Right.
And I was in the blue seats at Madison Square Garden. And in those days, there were no video screens and all, so we didn't have incessant shots of Mick with his eyeliner and the glitter, all that stuff. And to me, sitting up there listening to them in the blue seats at Madison Square Garden, they weren't any better than most bar bands that I was hearing in that period.
Oh,
I saw them twice on that tour. Actually, both in the same day. One up in the blue seats, and then the evening show in the 25th row downstairs. And that evening show was amazing. I might agree with you about the early show because the distance and all that stuff, but Mick Taylor played the most incredible solo on Love in Vain that I've ever heard. I mean, I've got all the bootlegs from the rest of the shows, and they're not quite.
So do I.
And I accidentally taped that show, and
play it for it.
Well, it's out there now. People have it. I've seen it called something like 5 English Gentlemen in a New York Garden or something. So you should check that out because I wish they would. I know they have soundboard tapes of that whole tour. They really should put that show out, or at least that track. But,
there are some dynamite shows from that era. That Brussels show that they finally put out themselves.
Yes.
Is absolutely amazing. I mean, oh my God, that is just dynamite. That Mick Taylor guitar is just fantastic.
Yeah.
But I mean, there were some shows in that period where they were absolutely stunning. There's no question about it. But yeah, I think they definitely did drop off after that. Michael, do you want to defend them here? Or?
Well, first of all, as for those Madison Square Garden shows in '72, Al, were you at the afternoon show?
I think it was the afternoon show, yes.
Okay, because I've seen films and clips of that, and that did not sound so good. Because
no.
I mean, I think that was the show that there were films of it on the Dick Cavett show that was from around that time.
Yeah.
And
okay, I have seen that clip. Actually, that clip is on the Dick Cavett DVD. If you the Shout Factory DVD, it's actually been released legitimately.
Yeah.
So.
That is that's not a good example of that tour. But if that's the one you saw, I can understand why you felt that way. So.
Yeah.
But as for the dropping off of the period, I mean, I can definitely see that they went. I've heard different fans say different albums for when they started going downhill, and I can see the cases in a lot of them. I mean, after Exile on Main Street, the next album was Goat's Head Soup, which had some good songs, but was not as strong as the ones just before it. Yeah. And there was It's Only Rock and Roll, which I like a lot, actually, but I know...
that's good.
Same here.
Yeah.
Same here.
It's a great song.
Yeah, I mean, the side... I think most everything on side one is excellent, and then everything else I think is hit and miss. Yeah, Tattoo You was great, and then it dropped for a little bit, but I think it picked up for a little bit. I really liked... I'm such a fan, I don't even remember the name of the album.
Some Girls?
Some Girls?
No, after Some Girls.
Emotional Rescue.
No, I'm going several albums later.
Tattoo You.
Steel Wheels. I'm going all the way to Steel Wheels.
Yep.
I thought that was a good. I thought it was a very good album. And even Stones fans disagree with me on this one. A lot of them do. Voodoo Lounge, which was the next studio album after that, I thought that was a very good album. I really like that one. I still play that one a lot. And the ones that have come out since then, which would be Bridges to Babylon and Bigger Bang, I thought they were good. I mean, you might think I'm being a little biased here. I never thought there was any Stone studio album that was completely terrible, that didn't have at least something that was... There's some that definitely percentage was lower than others, and it's probably the same albums you're thinking of, the 80s albums, Dirty Work, Undercover. They had some songs I liked, but they definitely went downhill for a little bit from there. But I thought they made a nice recovery. Bigger Bang I was sort of in the middle with.
I actually think that their 70s output was phenomenal. I love their music of the 70s. And maybe their albums weren't consistently strong, but there's enough really strong tracks. If you were to do a compilation of great Rolling Stone songs, you've got so many of them.
Sure.
I mean, in the 70s alone, you talk about Black and Blue. Memory Motel is one of my favorite songs of theirs. And you can cherry pick tracks from all their albums, even in the decades that followed, and you can find some really great songs in there.
Oh yeah, there's no
as
shortage.
As a singles band, they're phenomenal.
Yeah,
they put out some great singles throughout
absolutely.
all the decades.
Absolutely.
So and I love the disco period. I thought "Miss You" was a terrific track. I loved "Emotional Rescue." I loved all that stuff. I didn't dismiss that at all. And yeah, like I said, "Mixed Emotions" is one of my favorite songs. I loved "Harlem Shuffle." I thought that was a terrific cover.
I did too. I thought that was excellent. The video on that was wonderful. and I also like "Stripped." I thought "Stripped" was great.
Stripped has some good things. I really like the version of "Slipping Away" on that. I really like that. But I would always like that song anyway. So
the only complaint I'd ever make about the Stones, and it's the kind of thing that John Lennon said, and I don't agree with everything John said, but he said that so much of what they did is just, a reworking of stuff that they've done already. And, in terms of production from Exile on Main Street, so much of their albums sound exactly the same, almost as if they could have all been recorded during the same time period. But I still love that production. There's a brightness, there's a punchiness to the production that I really like. So, if you love that kind of music, then the Stones are more your band.
I think one of the limitations with the Stones is that there are really only so many hundreds of ways that you can rework a Chuck Berry riff. And,
yes, exactly.
That's basically the DNA of most of the Stones catalog.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, I thought it was great seeing Keith on that special with Chuck Berry. When he produced that, and Taylor Hackford made it into a film, and there's that one rehearsal where Keith is playing the intro, and let's face it, if one person on earth besides Chuck Berry can do a characterful Chuck Berry intro, it's Keith. He's playing the intro, and Chuck keeps stopping him and saying, come on, do it right. And at one point, he turns his back to Chuck and towards the camera and just rolls his eyes. It's a really great scene. But yeah, anyway.
It's still a skill to be able to write more Chuck Berry-esque songs, Even Paul McCartney said it as far as, 50s rock and roll. A lot of people think that it's so easy to write songs in that style, but it's not as easy as it sounds. So to be able to come up with all the different riffs that Keith has, that is a talent to itself. And to be able to build a song around that, I really, I think that is a talent. It's definitely a talent that Keith has.
Let me ask another question. Who, and this is probably an obvious answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who progressed further musically in their career, the Stones or the Beatles?
This is on?
Alan, I'm gonna let you start. That's such a. Is that a softball question or what?
I don't know. I don't think the Stones were necessarily concerned with the idea of musical progression. I'm not even sure the Beatles were, but they did it. They were always looking for new things. I don't think the Stones were particularly always looking for new things. I think at heart, they really wanted to keep playing blues and Chuck Berry and that kind of stuff. And I think they may have sort of got sucked along in the Beatles' wake, as their big friendly competitors of like, okay, let's try some of this stuff too. But, as soon as the Beatles weren't there anymore, they basically went back to, apart from the disco thing, which, sorry, Ken, I loathe disco in any form. And I don't like when the Stones do it. I don't like it when McCartney does it. And
sorry.
Yeah, please. So so they did some experiments there, but I don't consider that musical progression. I don't, it seems to me if you listen to the most recent Stones studio stuff, you don't see a huge amount of musical progression. They're much more facile players. They're better than they were on their first albums. But it's not like the distance from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to "Strawberry Fields" has been covered.
No.
I think Brian Jones really was the one most responsible for the musical adventurousness that the Stones showed in the mid '60s, and it might have gone even further if he hadn't gotten sucked into the vortex of drugs and basically just became so burned out that he just had no more usefulness to the group when Mick and Keith dumped them in '69.
I hate to keep lashing back on the Stones, but I loved when they did Black Limousine, and I was hoping that would be a taste of more to come, and it wasn't. It was just a one shot deal, and because I really thought they were great. They were great. Some of those blues songs on those early albums are wonderful. They had the instrumentation. Mick was a great singer, and they just played really well. And I was really sorry that whole thing didn't continue. Michael, do you agree with that, or does that strike a chord with you? Or
a little bit, because as far as the Stones and progression, whereas let's say the Beatles or McCartney, they might try on a new style for an album, or for more than just one track. I think the Stones over the years, they might try a different style for one track on an album, but then then they're on to the next thing, or they're back to what they were doing. But as for the progression, to go back in years, let's go back to the 60s for a minute. Obviously, when the Beatles released Rubber Soul, that was quite different from the albums before then. And, that's considered a leap forward. And then the next Stones album after that, and I don't think it was necessarily copying them, but the first Stones album of 1966 was Aftermath. And that was a pretty diverse album, pretty musically. I think maybe even more than Rubber Soul. I'm not saying it's better than Rubber Soul, but if you made a list of all the different types of styles on Aftermath, I think it's quite a list. And then of course, I admit that when Revolver came out, that outdid it. But so for a minute there, they really were, so for a few months there, I think the Stones did have the most progressive rock album.
Interesting.
But it didn't last long.
Michael, Alan touched on this earlier, but John's comments about the Stones copying the Beatles, 2 months later, do you think that that John was being unfair, or do you think that there's some accuracy to that?
I'm somewhere in the middle about that. You see, there are a couple the cases that John cites, and then I'll get into the cases that I won't list them all, but some of the cases John cited, some of them have some validity. Some of them I might give the Stones an out on reasonable doubt, and there's some that just don't make sense either because of chronology or for other reasons. But then I've seen the fans of the Beatles when they're ragging on the Stones and they're saying, "Oh, this was the Stones copying this." Some of it gets into like Paul is Dead clue territory.
Yeah.
But just to run by some of the examples John said. Now he said, "As Tears Will Go By" was a copy of Yesterday. I could see that. I can't really defend that one. Although part of me wonders if maybe part of that was sort of a put on. Not a put on, but sort of like, okay, you guys, you think you're so smart, you did an acoustic song with strings, we can do it too, you guys. But I think their heart was in it too. But I blame Andrew mostly on that one. Satanic Majesty's Request, Pepper, can't really say too much to defend that one. But the one that I never understood, well, two that John said that I really can't go with. Number one, when he said "We Love You" was a copy of "All You Need Is Love," I don't hear it. And that's aside from the fact that I've seen different recording dates given for "We Love You," but the ones that John Wynne says in his book predate "All You Need Is Love." So that should, if that's right, that would put an end to it right there. But I don't hear any similarity between those two songs at all. But then the one that really I thought was kind of off was, didn't John say that he thought that "Miss You" was a copy of his "Bless You"?
I didn't never heard
You've
that.
told me that.
I don't remember that.
Whoa, I haven't seen that one.
I think I saw that. I think Robert Rodriguez mentioned that on his board. I think that's where I saw that. I'm a little baffled. Other than the title and the fact that John does go something on, which kind of sounds like the riff of "Miss You," but I don't know.
Maybe it's a copy of "Coming Up."
Yeah. Michael,
I'm not sure what the chronology is, but they're both rattling around the same garbage pail here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Al.
Wait, whoa. Did you call "Coming Up" garbage?
Oh.
Oh.
Uh-oh. Ding, ding. Okay. In this corner.
Al, it sounded like you were going to ask something to me.
Defend yourself, Alan.
Is it Ken a disco song?
I don't call it a disco song. First of all, the live version is not.
No, certainly not.
The studio one, I don't really.
Studio one.
The studio one, I don't consider to be disco. I don't really think of it as disco. That all falls into that same category. There are a lot of people who think "Goodnight Tonight" is disco, and Lawrence Juber told me it's not a disco song; it's a dance track.
Yeah.
It depends upon your ears and what you're hearing. So I never thought of Coming Up as being disco.
Plus, when it came out, it was right at the height of the as I call them, the disco sucks wars, and the fact that it was on a 12-inch single, and CBS particularly insisted on calling those 12-inch singles disco singles. So it could have been, Leonard Cohen. And if he had put out a 12-inch single, people would have said, sure, it's a disco record. It's on a 12-inch.
Although I got to say, when that came out, the bass line, that made me think it was doing like a disco. It sounded to me like a disco-type bass line, but maybe I'm just reaching.
A little bit.
For Coming Up?
I agree.
A little bit.
Oh, I thought you were talking about Good Night Tonight.
Oh, we talked about both.
Actually,
so, yeah.
Either.
Okay.
Either one. Michael, wanted to ask you a question about Mick.
Okay.
As a performer, because in recent years he's appeared on various award shows or on Saturday Night Live or and has absolutely wiped up the floor with any of these these young bands. And I just was wondering where you kind of stand on Mick's abilities as a performer and as a frontman, say, in comparison to a Roger Daltrey, a Bono, and other, contemporaries and semi-contemporaries of his?
It's a tough question. Well, first of all, Roger Daltrey and Bono are two people that, I used to be a big Who fan. I still like the Who a lot. But I haven't really followed the recent years, so I couldn't really compare you to what Roger's been doing recently.
Sure.
You two, I kind of haven't followed in a long time. But just to sum up Mick as an entertainer, I guess that's what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he can do a great job. I thought he was great on SNL and some of the award shows I've seen. And when I hear people that aren't generally Stones fans, as I did at the time of these appearances, that were saying, "Oh, he was really good,"
yeah,
I figure he must be doing something right. So yeah, he's got charisma, as David Liederoff would say about himself. Yeah, he's still got it.
Yeah,
he's great at doing comedy. He is great at doing comedy, I tell you.
Yeah, he's
that one sketch on Saturday Night Live with Mike Myers and him, where Mike Myers is playing Mick Jagger and Mick is playing Keith.
That was classic. Yes,
that was so good. Mick was so spot on with Keith, and who would know him better? So.
No, that was great.
Anybody?
Anyway, yeah. Anyway, anybody have anything short items or tips or anything they want to bring up?
Well, one thing about again the Beatles versus Stones comparison you have to take into account is the fact that it took the Stones about a year to really take off in America. Now, they did it a lot quicker in England. It was by the third record. But in this country, it really took until, even though Tell Me and Time Is on My Side and then Heart of Stone were moderate hits, it really took until the last time for them to really take off here. And of course, then again, the next record was Satisfaction, which put them over the top as the number 2 band in the world. But
Satisfaction just had its 50th anniversary, I think, last month.
A couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
Just to play devil's advocate, you could argue that perhaps if Mick and Keith were going to play John's game, they could say that Day Tripper was in some ways ripped off of Satisfaction because they're both songs start with a memorable guitar riff.
Same key.
And so there you go.
I never really noticed that about Day Tripper until a few years ago when I was doing a podcast. I was going to do features where, and I did one of this like this, where I would take a particular Beatle record and I would play other records that came out in England around the same month, right in the same month, just so you could see what their contemporaries were issuing at the same time. And when I was looking at the records that came around the time of Day Tripper, I saw several 45s by other bands that sounded to me like they could have been all inspired by Satisfaction. And then when I saw Day Tripper, at the same time, that made me think, well, maybe that was too. And then I thought about the drum beat in the middle, with that, the snare on all fours like you hear in the bridge. Because some of the other records that were out around that time were I forget which one it was. One of the Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Stills and Nash.
Oh, Bend It?
No, it wasn't Bend It. It might have been You Make It Move. I'm not sure. I don't think it was Hold Tight, but and then you got Keep On Running by Spencer Davis,
Right.
which is that same kind of beat and the fuzz guitar. And not as obvious. I never would have thought of this until I saw it in the chronology. If you know the Zombie song, Is This the Dream? The chorus of that is kind of satisfaction. It's got that E to the D, but in the E root. I'm being geeky now, so I'll stop. But
well, if you like to do that sort of thing, I mean, here are two that didn't come out at the same time, but they're fundamentally the same song. The Beatles' "Drive My Car" and Jimi Hendrix' "Crosstown Traffic."
Oh yeah.
They both have that do 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 do. Beatles have it in the bass line. Hendrix has it right up front, and they're both about one's about traffic, one's about cars.
That's right.
I think there's a very definite connection there.
I never thought about that, but you're right.
Wow.
Yeah, and
I never thought about that.
And oddly enough, both of those songs have been used by radio stations as their traffic beds.
Well, it makes sense.
Depending on the format. Yeah.
Sure. Well, anyway.
But actually, the guitar riff that the Beatles used in Day Tripper was borrowed from Watch Your Step from Bobby Parker.
Oh, yeah.
Because, John Lennon played that on the interview with Dennis Elsis, and that's also where they got, I think, the riff from I Feel Fine is from there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of more obvious on I Feel Fine than it is on Day Tripper, but it's definitely there on that.
Yeah. So,
but I mean,
everybody borrows from
other
artists. So.
Which brings up a point, and that's one little thing that annoys me a little bit about when I hear Beatle fans going off on the Stones as copying. Is that I often hear Beatles fans talk about Beatle records and say, "Oh, this was influenced by this was influenced by this record." But if the same sort of degree of influence is on a Stones record, they call it copying, and sometimes I don't think that's fair. For example, they'll say, "I Saw Her Standing There" was influenced by Talking About You, but 19th Nervous Breakdown was a complete ripoff of Diddly Daddy. And I don't know, that doesn't sound fair to me. It's like, I think the difference between being influenced by and being derivative of something shouldn't be based on, what you think of the group doing it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think sometimes in the Beatles versus Stones critique, on both sides I see this. So I'm not just bashing Beatles fans here. I don't want to do it because I am one. But I think they're both guilty of a little hypocrisy now and again.
Hypocrisy. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Very true.
I was just going to cap that by just saying this. So that's why in both boards, on both Beatle boards and Stones boards, I'm often seen as the guy. Beatle boards see me as the Stones guy. Stones boards see me as the Beatles guy. When really what I am, I'm the can't we all just get along guy.
Right.
Yeah. Because I love both groups, and I got into the Beatles first, and the Stones, it was actually just because I had collected all the Beatles records. It was almost like, okay, what do I do now? Oh, the Stones, of course. But that was before I knew that. I think that was before I even knew about the rivalry, whether it exists or not, or to what degree it exists. But I mean, I just heard records I liked, and there may be more overall brilliance in the Beatles records, but my ears just like the Stones records too. So there's something to like about everything. And that's where that's my own stand on it.
Anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been really enlightening. We all, I think we all got a lot out of this, and we all learned something, and looking at it from a different perspective. So, Michael, first of all, thank you for coming aboard. Again, Michael is the author of the theme of this show that you hear every week. So let's give a big round of applause to Michael.
Yay!
Thank you. And the official name of that piece of music is theme for Ken and Steve. I guess I better change that now. But I had to call it theme for Ken and Steve because the title "Things We Said Today" that already been taken.
Oh, okay. And yeah, I know who did. And you have you are a performer, and you are performing in the New York, New Jersey area, correct?
Yes. One gig I'll bring up because it does have a little bit of Beatles relevance. September 19th at Randy Now's Man Cave in Bordertown, New Jersey. I'll be performing on a bill I'll be playing the bass for somebody some of you may have heard of. Her name is Palmyra Del Ran. She was in a band in the 90s called the Frigs, an all-girl band on the underground scene, the garage scene. She works as a soloist now. I'm her bass player, and she's also now, you might have heard her, she is a DJ on Little Steven's Underground Garage on the Sirius Network.
Okay.
You can hear her on Sunday mornings at 8 to noon on the East Coast. But the reason I said it's got a little Beatles significance, this gig, is because also on that gig are some friends of Ken's, the Gripweeds.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they just put out a brand new album, which is great, called How I Won the War. And of course, you know how they got their name and how they got the title of the album. But they also cover The Inner Light on the new album. But it's a great, they put out really strong, edgy rock and roll that's melodic. So if that's what you're into, as most Beatle fans are, then you should check out that band, the Gripweeds.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, Michael, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me on the show.
I've had a good
time.
You're welcome. And next time we need somebody to defend the Stones. No, seriously, you did a great. You were great. You really were.
Thank you. And I got to say, I didn't really have to defend them too much today. I think we all seem to be on the same page on a lot of what we said today.
Yeah, we didn't hit him hard enough, guys.
Yeah, we better start over.
Yeah, I know. I know. Anyway, anybody got anything to mention upcoming this week that we should let people know?
Well, I have something I'd like to plug on my website because I'd like to tell all of our listeners to be on the watch for two very big special contests that I have going, one of which times perfectly with the 50th anniversary of the Beatles at Shea, because Dave Swenson has been a great guest on our show, and also I've done an interview with him privately, which you can catch on my website. I'm giving away his two books on the Beatles at Shea Stadium and the Beatles in Cleveland. That should be around the time when this show gets posted for the first time. And then also, not long after that, I'm going to be giving away the new John Lennon vinyl box set, courtesy of Universal Music. So that'll be coming up pretty soon. So if you can, go to my website. It's kenmichaelsradio.com. I'll have a special contest for both those different contests, the Beatle books and the Lennon albums on vinyl.
Cool.
Okay. Alan, I know you got something coming up.
Right, because this weekend, when this show airs, it'll be the right in the middle of the Chicago Fest for Beatles fans, which is August 14th, 15th, and 16th at the Hyatt Regency O'Hare, just outside of Chicago. So if any of you are still kind of on the fence about going, please, by all means, come by. And if you do, come by. I'm going to be all over the place. So please come by and say hi.
Okay.
It's
Alan,
all over the place.
Yeah.
All over the place. Alan, you got anything to mention?
No, I'm just going to be floating in my pool this week.
There you go.
Go Red Sox.
Living the life.
Red Sox. Right.
Also, since Al mentioned the Fest for Beatle fans, I will be a part of Danbury Fields Forever this coming weekend.
Oh,
that's on August the 15th, on the actual anniversary of the Beatles at Shea. That's at the Charles Ives Center in Danbury, Connecticut. Come by and say hi. I'll be introducing some of the Beatles tribute bands there. Say hi to Charles Rosnay. So a lot going on that whole day. There's, I believe Charles said 11 different bands all performing on stage. Beatles and solo music throughout the whole day. What could be better?
And if you go to our Podbean website, if you go to podbean.com and look up our podcast, you'll find our interviews with both Charles Rosenet and Mark Lapidus as two of the last 5 shows we've done. We just did, and you can actually find all our shows or most of our shows at the Podbean site. And also, they're also streamed on YouTube. But the Charles show was really cool because he talked about not only Danbury, but he talked about his some of the things that have happened to him over the years on his Beatle tours. And Mark surprised the heck out of us with the anecdotes about Beatlefest and some of the things that I didn't know about things that had happened at Beatlefest, and some of his opinions, including if one of the Beatles was to show at Beatlefest, which one did he think would show up? And I was completely caught by surprise by that answer. So those shows are online and they're well worth listening to, and we hope you'll catch them. Anyway, till next time, on behalf of Allan Kozinn, Al Sussman, Ken Michaels, our special guest Michael Lynch, and myself, Steve Marinucci, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.